but the main work started in the month afterwards, I think. So it's roughly 1 year old. Okay, so I hope it's better now. So the content will be, I'll start with some introductions, give you a history about collection testing, or testing in Ansible as in general, then how to improve on the previous situation, then I'll talk about Antsibull-nox, and then I'll give some kind of, it's half a demo, half a presentation about how to use Ansible-nox to test the collection. And then I have this Q&A point at the end, but also in between, if you're having questions, please feel free to ask. Okay, so who am I? I'm a software engineer who's also managing Linux servers. In my previous job, I was managing a few more. This, at my current job, just a few, like a handful. At home, I personally also have 2 Linux servers, which I'm also administrating, so obviously I'm using Ansible for that. So I cannot really show you any big deployments, but at least I'm using Ansible for some stuff. I've been an Ansible user since 2015, approximately. I've started contributing. I checked the Git history for that. Something between 2016 and 17. Then I started maintaining some more things, mostly in 2020. I'll come to that later. And at some point also there was this Ansible community steering committee founded. I'm also a member of that one. I'm not sure whether you heard much about it if you're using the Ansible package, which is Ansible Core Plus, some collections. The steering committee is mainly working on that one, I would say. Good, collection testing history. So, some time ago, well, not that long, but also not that short anymore, because it's already 2026, there was this one big repository, Ansible, which had basically Ansible, what is now Ansible Core, together with like, I think around 2,000 modules, plugins. It was quite a huge number of things in that repository, and I'm also not completely honest here, because if you go back a few more years, at some point, initially it was a big repository, then things were moved out into different repositories, then a couple of years later things were moved back in again, and then everything was kept in there until 2020, when the big split happened, but I'll talk about that a bit later. Anyway, so for this part of history, it was a big repository with everything in there. And for testing, at some point, I checked actually in November 2016, a tool called Ansible Test was added. That was basically a test runner for all the things that were in the Ansible repository. It handles everything: sanity tests, unit tests, and integration tests. And it basically determines which tests to run, it then runs them, handles the reporting, tells the bot what to display. If you ever had an issue, or well, mostly a pull request in Ansible, you might have seen these nice Ansible comments, which basically listed you all the sanity test errors which you had. Ansible test was taking care of all that. Collections were added first in Ansible 2.8 as a technical preview, and the first version which like kind of fully supported, though fully is always an interesting question, is 2.9. Well, shortly after the 2.9 release, like in early 2020, this big split happened. Until then, there was this big monorepo with everything in there, and at that point, basically almost all the modules and plugins out of the Ansible repository were moved into separate repositories into various collections. Some supported content got moved into supported collections, and there were a couple of community collections, and then there was this big catch-all collection, Community General, which basically got just everything else, which was a huge amount of stuff. I'm not, maybe 1,000 something. Eventually, a couple of months later, we split it up again into Community General and Community Network, and moved all the network stuff into the other one. And after that, I think Community General had a bit under 1,000 plugins. And some of them were also further moved to other places. And in 2020, a lot of moving happened. And nowadays, things are pretty stable, I would say, but sometimes still things are moved. One famous example maybe is Community Proxmox, which there were plans like made 2 years ago at Config Management Camp to start a new collection. Then for a year, basically nothing happened. And last year, we tried again. And well, we found one guy named Jeff who was kindly convinced that, well, maintaining the collection is a great idea, and thank you very much for doing it. And well, now he's basically managing or maintaining Community Proxmox for almost a year now. And now I heard there's a new maintainer coming as well, Ian Lunchbox. I don't know if the person is here or not somewhere at the conference. I don't even know who he is. I just know the name from various places, but I have no clue what that person actually is. Good. Now we have a lot of collections and Ansible core, and at that point, Ansible test was still the main testing tool for everything. Ansible test itself, let me quickly, I already mentioned we have 3 parts: sanity testing, unit testing, and integration testing. And Ansible test does, well, a lot of things, like for unit testing, it's basically wrapping PyTest, but it's calling it on the right path structure. Also, it makes sure that, depending on which parts of a collection, like for example modules or module utils, they have to target more Python versions, maybe also target Python versions, than like the controller-only code. So it basically knows which code has to run with which Python version, and then makes sure to run everything with the correct Python versions. For integration tests, they are basically Ansible roles, unless they have a run.sh file, so you can also do like more fancy stuff like installing things and invoking Ansible playbook manually or other Ansible tools. But yeah, it's a pretty flexible thing, works pretty well. Well, it's also a pretty major and really stable tool, I would say. It's doing a lot of things. It offers various choices of isolation. You can isolate things as virtual environments, which is not that isolated. If you're installing packages and tests, for example, you can isolate in Docker containers or in VMs. And especially when you have access to the Ansible CI infrastructure, which is used by Ansible Core, but also like in the Community General and a few more collections, then you can also use VMs in CI, which is really, really nice. There's some authentication happening, so you cannot use it as a regular user because you need special credentials, because you can basically run stuff, and I think Red Hat pays for it, so which is pretty neat. Good. It also supports things like split controller target testing, like if you're testing something on the target which doesn't, originally target and controller Python versions were basically the same. That stopped being the case, I think, officially probably before 2.10, but in, I think 2.11 it really starts to be a difference. You have things like support for different CI groups for integration testing. You can have preparation roles for integration testing. You have these cloud plugins that allow to start sidecar containers, provide variables for integration testing. You have JUnit reporting and Ansible bot support. There's code coverage collection and aggregation, which for all the kind of tests, so also the sanity tests, have a bit of code coverage because they are doing import testing. For the unit tests, of course, but also for the integration tests. For there you have to basically hook up into Ansible Playbook somehow, so that you can basically see which lines of the modules you're testing have been covered by the test cases you're running there. That's something which I've only seen in Ansible tests so far, nowhere else. Then there's also change detection, which is also, especially for bigger CIs, Ansible, when everything was in there, it was really important, because you don't want to wait like 1 hour for CI to run through for every commit. In Community General, and some other collections is also still pretty important because there's a huge amount of tests. You don't want to run them if you like change a little documentation string somewhere. And yeah, it basically supports all these things out of the box. Well, when the split happened, the main testing tool for the new collections was also Ansible Test. I don't know when testing support for collections has been added to it, and whether it was already in 2.8, in 2.9, I think it was already there. There were also Molecule and Ansible-int, but I mean, they do kind of other things. I mean, Ansible-int is pretty much orthogonal to Ansible Test anyway. They're testing very different things. Molecule is kind of similar to integration testing, part of Ansible Test, but also there they have different sets of features, so they are not really comparable. Maybe that will change eventually, but right now they are different. Yeah, and so especially if you have a collection with, especially with modules and plugins, not necessarily with roles, then a lot of testing is still done, especially on the sanity and unit testing side with Ansible Test. And integration tests is sometimes done with Ansible Test, sometimes with Molecule, sometimes with both, or I don't know, something completely different maybe. Depends. Well, Ansible Test also has some downsides. The most annoying thing which everyone who contributed to a collection who tried to run Ansible Test probably noticed is that you have to check out the repository in a very specific path structure. You need to have like an Ansible collections directory inside the namespace of the collection. Inside that, the repository checked out by the name of the collection. And if the collection is not in the root of the repository, either you have the structure inside the repository or you have fun. Because then you have to manually copy code out of the repository to somewhere else and run it there. That's not really great, but I mean, people get used to it. It's kind of okay, but not so great. If you have dependencies on other collections, you have to basically make sure that you install them manually because Ansible Test won't install them. During the migration, some dependency files have been created, but support was never added for, I don't know, many reasons, I guess. But this, also if you use isolation, like in Docker containers, then you cannot just install the collection somewhere on your machine, but they have to be in the same path structure, which can also be surprising if you don't really know that. Then you thought you installed everything, and then it tells you, no, it's not there. And then you have to figure out, oh, it's not in this structure, but it's somewhere else. Which is especially for contributors which just want to fix a bug and test it, it's really annoying. Then another thing is that's more for maintainers. If you want to define a collection-specific sanity test, there's no way to do it. I mean, Ansible Core has some core-specific sanity tests. They are like in the tests, or they used to be in test sanity code smell, I think. There you could basically add a test together with a JSON file and which described when to run it, and then Ansible Test would run it during sanity tests. That never was supported for collections, and yeah. Another thing is that it's really hard to get new features in that don't benefit core. In the beginning it looked like it might be possible, but after a couple of years it became clear that this basically never happens and never will happen, from some comments which showed up later. Another annoying thing is that if you use Ansible Test in CI, there's always this CI matrix shuffling happening when a new Ansible Core version comes out, because then you have to add a new Ansible Core version to your CI matrix. You have to copy the latest sanity ignore file to the new version and so on. This, I mean, only happens like every half a year, but that's also a bit annoying. And it's usually not so easy to automate because basically every collection has its own kind of setup of how Ansible Test is run. And also if you're using GitHub Actions, there are so many different ways how you could run it, so it's, if you want to automate it, it's really hard. Well, so how can we improve on this? At least for the one aspect of running additional sanity tests. In the beginning, in 2020, I added a small tool to the community internal test tools collection to run extra sanity tests. My hope was still that this might end up in Ansible test sanity itself at some point, which never happened. Well, eventually I moved it to Antsibull-nox, and then I deprecated that thing and removed it, so it's no longer there. Another tool which came up was by Alexei. I mean, you know him by Rassos. He's one of the co-maintainers of Community General. He invented this tool Antsibull-nox, which makes it very easy to run Ansible tests, different versions of it on a collection. It will basically, if it's not in the right path structure, it will copy the collection into the correct path structure and run Ansible test there. You can tell it which Ansible core version you want, and it creates a venv and installs Ansible core in there and runs that one. So it makes it much easier, especially for contributors, to just run something. It also got other features over time, and Alexei is still very actively working on this one. Well, what about the future of Ansible test? Well, there haven't been collection features for a long time. There have been many statements and rumors. If you have been at config management camp in the previous years, there's usually at some point the state of the community, or also at other community events, sometimes they are mentioning that Ansible tests, there will be some news soon, but so far I never heard anything or seen anything more concrete. There have been talks about splitting it up into two tools, one for collections, one for core. There have been talks about another team taking ownership and continuing development. There have been talks to just use Ansible-lint molecule instead, which, as I mentioned earlier, is not so great because they are not really replacements, but they cover other aspects. A molecule is great, but it's very different from the integration tests provided by Ansible tests. So, yeah. And eventually there was an official statement, or kind of official. I mean, Civil, I guess you know who Civil is. I think I'm not sure what the official role is. He's kind of lead of the team lead for core. He basically posted in May 2024 that, I put in the full quote. That's why the font size is a bit smaller, so everything put in. The important thing I put in bold. It's basically our goal forward. It's basically to stop adding new testing functionality for collections for Ansible test and move the Ansible test included with core back to only testing core. But no timelines, work, discussions, or architecture have happened as yet. So basically, something will happen. No one knows when, and Ansible test will go away for collections somewhere in the future, apparently. So, yeah, well.
Nothing's changed.
Well, as you know, in my talks I usually include some pictures from time to time, which are not AI generated, but real cats living either in my household or close to my household. So here's one, so you don't fall asleep, in case it's too boring. Okay, another motivation for working on, maybe the big question now is, so what now? We know that something will change, but what do we do now? Another motivation for me was, especially last year, I wanted to get rid of Python 2 support for several collections, in particular Community Crypto. Version 3 was supposed to be released in May 2025. So basically, in the beginning of 2025, 1 year ago, I had like a couple of months left to work on it. And, well, to add features like type-ins, you need to somehow also check types. There's some support. You can use MyPy for that. Nowadays, there's also experimental support in Rust, but, well, if you want full support, MyPy is probably still the choice to go right now. Ansible test runs MyPy, but only for core, not for collections. And simply running MyPy on the repository is also not so great, because MyPy actually looks at imports. And if the collection is not in the correct structure and you are calling it from the correct place, it won't find your imports. And if it cannot find the code that you import, then it cannot really check types because it doesn't know where the code is or where the definitions are. So at that point I was a bit like, okay, so what should I do? There are like three options from my point of view. The first one is to hope that the situation magically fixes it by itself. It's not really realistic, like it was beginning of February. I wanted to have the collection released in May. Just waiting for something random to happen, not a good idea. I could also try to nag people until something does happen, but that usually also takes longer than 2-3 months, so that's also not a good choice. Or the last option is like try to improve on the situation myself, which is in the end what I basically had to do. Well, if you want to do something, you first have to think about what you actually want to do and what the properties of the thing you want to create should be. And for that, yes, basically, I tried to write down some points which I had, I think, it's a year ago, so I'm not 100% sure anymore, I had in my mind when I wanted to create a new testing tool. I mean, first it should be relatively easy for contributors to use. If it's a bit harder to use for maintainers, it's kind of okay-ish as long as it's easy for contributors. So especially, there shouldn't be any requirements on like a specific path structure where you check out the collection. That's one of the most annoying things about Ansible test, and not having that would be really great. Then also it should take care of Python and collection requirements if possible. It should make the update the CI matrix step, which happens like every half a year when a new Ansible core version comes out, a bit easier, or even trivial if possible, but it's not always possible, but it should make it definitely easier than what was happening before. It should have kind of sensible defaults, so there's always the question, what are sensible defaults? It should also avoid reinventing the wheel, so it should use existing tools as they are there, if possible, instead of just inventing or redoing everything. And it should also be easy to add collection-specific tests. Like for example, in 2 collections, I have in one collection, I'm community DNS, I'm including the so-called public suffix list, which is a public database containing domain endings basically which are public, and everything below that is private. So it's not just TLDs but a bit more. And I want to basically have a check which checks whether there's a new version of it. And of course I can do something very different, but I also want to integrate it as a test in there, so that if I want to run all the collection tests, this test is also run. Of course, you can always smuggle that into a unit test, but that's kind of abused and not so great. Good. The first thing which I tried was looking at talks. You might have seen talks Ansible, and I thought that they're already using, I also know that several, especially Red Hat maintained Ansible collections are using talks for various things. Talks is also used a lot of in other Python or Ansible-related projects. So I thought it was maybe a good choice. I tried to see how I could get it to do some things without having to repeat everything into the collection-specific talks file. If you don't know talks, it's basically running tasks for you, especially tests for Python code. It can use different Python versions. It handles virtual environments, installs dependencies, and then runs a test for you. And the problem was that talks is not, you can write even plugins, but it's not flexible enough. It's basically, you have to repeat, if you want to do something like copy the collection to a separate directory structure and run the test there, you have to write that every time in every talks file for every collection. So you have a lot of things you have to copy and paste around, which is not so great. Another similar tool is called Nox, which I don't know if anyone heard of you about it. Some of them probably yes. It's similar to talks, but the difference is that basically you don't write the description as an ini file, but you write Python code to describe your tests. And the nice thing about Python code is that you can import other Python code, so you can import a library which adds tests for you. And that's basically what I ended doing. Basically, I wrote a library which is used together with Nox to add tests for your collection. And then, of course, you can also use Nox to add own tests for whatever you want. And the good thing is that Nox, by employing Python, is flexible enough to do all the things I wanted to do. So my decision was pick Nox. And also another thing is that for some of the other Ansible tools or libraries, we were already using Nox, so I was already familiar with it, which was also, at least from my side, a good point. So the very first iteration, which I checked in the Git history, was actually at the end of January last year. I tried this in community DNS. I basically added a Nox file and added some code which basically added some sessions which run various tests for the Python code in there, like also for MyPy. And especially for MyPy and also for PyLint, you have to basically create a directory structure where you have Ansible collections, namespace, in this case community, DNS, and then the collection content. And if you haven't really checked it out, then it has to create it and copy it over. And I started doing something like that, and to see whether it works, and it worked fine. That was basically iteration 0. It wasn't really a library yet, but the next step was create a library out of it, move the code over there. And so basically my Nox file at that point reduced to this. I'm doing an import Antsibull-nox. I'm handling an import error in case you don't have it. That will tell you that you need to install it. So somewhere where Nox can find it. And then basically I'm calling one function which adds a lot of, or several sessions to the Nox file, which execute various collection-related tests. And actually the first commit for that was I checked on March 15th last year. In the following days, weeks, I added some more tests, some more sessions, and the good thing is that, for example, also support for Ansible test itself. Running it also for different Python versions and for Ansible core versions. The good thing is that, or in that case, Ansible-nox itself knows about which Python versions are supported by which Ansible core versions. And then there's meta runtime YAML in the collection which tells Ansible-nox which Python versions, which Ansible core versions are supported by the collection. So basically the Ansible-nox can on its own find out which Ansible core versions you actually want to run against. And so you can basically tell it add like sanity and unit tests, and it can just add everything as sessions there without you having to specify explicitly what kind of versions you want to have in there. Yeah, I mean, one thing which was so great with that one is that basically you had to call a lot of Python functions in your Nox file to add all these sessions to the Nox. At some point I started a small discussion with some, especially with Max and some others, about what to do about this. And the idea was to have maybe a config file which is read and then integrated by Ansible-nox and that turned into a set of sessions. So that you can easily describe sessions in a very short way, which isn't like full of stuff you have to copy and paste to other collections, and then basically create sessions out of it, and you can still of course add more manual sessions if you want to. And that was basically iteration 2. We had some discussions. I first wanted to use YAML because, well, YAML is not great, but good enough. And everyone is already familiar with it. Max suggested maybe to try Toml because I don't know if you know Toml. Toml is a configuration language which is relatively decent. I mean, I'm not really a really huge fan of it, but it's also not too bad. Most importantly, there exists a library in Python which can read and write, or actually round trip Toml files by keeping most of it, including comments, which is really helpful because if you want, I mean, some of the, you have to still mention some Ansible core versions or Python versions inside your TOML file. And if you want to have some automatism which like adds a new Ansible core version and does some modifications, it's really great if you can modify this file without like screwing up the formatting or getting rid of the comments or other things. So TOML is, I think, quite a good choice for this. It's still readable enough, it's not as bad as YAML, and there's good tooling for it. And so the Nox file itself will reduce even further. I mean, the boilerplate is still the same, but instead of having these long calls, adding the tests, there's simply one line left, which adds, or which tells it basically like load the TOML file and add all the sessions from there. And then of course you can still add other stuff. Yes?
I have a question
yeah.
about TOML specifically, because handling Ansible, TOML files in Ansible is pretty difficult because there is no parser for it yet.
Yes.
So why?
Well, the good thing is that, two things maybe. The first thing is that you don't really have to modify these files with Ansible. I mean, of course you can, but you don't have to. So from that point of view, it's okay. And second, we can still add tools to Ansible. Actually, in Community General, there's currently a pull request where someone is adding, I think, a module to modify TOML files. So it's coming.
Thank you.
Welcome. And yeah, and the default TOML file, I mean, there's also like a small CLI tool, Antsibull-nox, which like creates a configuration for you for your collection. The default file it creates is basically this. It defines a lint session, which by default it has several things automatically enabled. It now disables iSort and black because that's maybe a bit too controversial, or you really want that if you want to enable it. And that's like a documentation check using Ansible-nox lint collection docs. Okay, here's another cat picture. And yeah, so let's try this out maybe as a kind of demo sum up. But let me check how much time actually do I have left. It's not much, right? Good.
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. Good. So, I mean, you might have seen the collection template. If you use that one, you get a GitHub action-based CI matrix, which is using this Ansible test GitHub action by default. If you want to have more tests, you have to basically add your own workflows, which is also, many people also modify the existing workflow, and in the end, every collection has slightly different workflows, which is hard to have something to update everything. So let's use Ansible-nox to do something better. I mean, there's this, you can just install it with pip or pip. I mean, you can also just install Nox somehow. And Nox has some mechanism that you can embed dependencies on the Nox file as comments into the Nox file. And if it finds them, it will basically create a small virtual environment, installs the dependencies there, and then uses them. So basically, you just have to Nox. I mean, you have to install Nox somehow. You can use your system repositories for it or whatever. And if you install Ansible-nox itself, you also have the CLI tool Ansible-nox. Then you can use Ansible-nox init to first create like do the grunt work, like to create the Nox file py and the Ansible-nox TOML file, which I showed earlier. And then the first thing you can do is run nox-l, which will basically show you the sessions. And that one I want to quickly show you. That basically looks like this. So, in case, yeah, it's not so. You basically have a set of sessions. There's a lint session, which basically consists, or there's a description that basically calls the code QA and the YAML lint session. and the Antsibull-nox config session, which validates the session, the configuration itself. Then there's a box check session, and there's a matrix generator session, which is not, the star basically means what is automatically executed if you don't tell it what to run. So it basically runs everything except this matrix generator. This matrix generator is especially useful if you add Ansible tests and other things later, because it allows to generate a CI matrix automatically from Nox and then use it. There, I'll come to that later. Oops, I have to go back here. So what you can do is, if you just run Nox without anything, it will just run all these sessions. One thing which is really useful if you use -R, it will reuse virtual environments instead of always installing everything again for everything you run, which is not so great for network traffic and also takes some time because it has to install everything. If you use that one, I usually use it, then it goes a lot faster. It just runs the tests after having set them up first. That's basically what I was showing. As the first thing, let's add Ansible test sanity and unit tests, and that's basically as simple as adding this to the toml file. Basically, you can also leave the include devel equals true away if you don't want devel tests or tests based on Ansible core devel, and this will automatically add all tests for all the Ansible core versions which are supported by your collection to the test matrix. And it's basically looking at these files. There's a meta runtime YAML which tells which Ansible core versions you are using, and then there's tests config YAML, which is actually strictly used by Ansible test to figure out which Python versions you are supporting. And so basically, it's only running tests for the correct Ansible core versions and for the correct Python versions. If you want to add integration tests, if you want to make it simple and just use the default container and just run all the tests, you can use this Ansible test integration with default container session, which is quite a long name, but that just describes what it does. If you just add this part, you basically get the full matrix of combinations of Python versions and Ansible core versions. You can also restrict it, because that's usually a way too big matrix. You can say for which core versions, which Python versions you actually want to test. There's also, I'll add that later, a more specific version where you can specifically specify a CI matrix with more for integration tests with Ansible tests with more details. It's you can basically specify the core versions, the targets, Docker containers to use or the remotes to use. You can specify values or lists. And if you have a list, then basically all the values will be added as different sessions. So for example, here I have a list with 2 elements, and then here I have 3 containers. This will result in 6 sessions being added of all combinations of the target and the Docker container, or Docker image. Well, and then there are also some shared workflows, at least if you're using GitHub Actions. You can so basically this you can add to a repository as a workflow on GitHub, and what it will do is basically run all the sanity or basically all the default sessions here, and here it will basically create a CI matrix with all your unit sanity and integration tests, and will run them separately. Maybe that I can show how it looks like. This collection is right. It's a bit hard to read. Yeah, basically it looks like this. So what it does, it runs the extra sanity tests, but then it also creates a matrix runner. Then when it has a matrix, it has, like, for example, in this case, there's 25 different integration tests that's running. It has 8 sanity tests, basically, and 8 unit tests. It's like 7 supported Ansible core versions plus Devil. And then there are also some EE execution environments built and basic smoke tests. They are basically run in parallel, like which specific ones these are, they are extracted from the TOML file. And then afterwards it's the uploading code coverage data if available from the other tests which actually produce it. And you get all of this just from this workflow. And the nice thing is that this workflow doesn't contain anything about specific Ansible core versions, so you don't basically have to ever touch it again. Also, what you can see here, this flag, this configuration, change detection, and PRs true. This is a kind of nice feature because it enables change detection for pull requests, which will make it only run tests which apply to this specific pull request. I mean, for small collections, it's not really, doesn't make too much sense, or maybe sometimes, especially for integration tests, you really want to run everything. But in big collections, like Community General, if you change one module, you don't want to run tests for all the other modules which have nothing to do with this module. So there, having something like change detection is really, really helpful. Okay, that's basically it. There are other things you can do, like add some more test sessions, replace some, like for example, Black ISO and Flake 8 can be replaced by rough. In the future there will be probably some more things, like MyPy, you can also replace it by rough at some point. Yeah, whatever you want basically. You can, I mean, if you are interested in something which would also interest other people, please create an issue, or even if you're interested, maybe a merge request. And if you want to add your own tests, you can basically just add them together to the Nox file. Like in this case, I think this is community router as. It basically loads like the default sessions from the TOML file, and then it adds another one to update doc fragments based on some code inside the collection. And there it's also using a utility function to be able to import code from the collection without having to make sure itself that everything is in the right directory structure. Well, then also I have a wish list of things I want to work on or others might want to work on. Adding like more tests, especially support for Molecule, because I haven't really used Molecule myself, so I don't really want to add support for Molecule yet, because I'm not sure how to add it in the best way without ruining everything. The other things like Azure Pipelines integration, structured output, improved error reporting, maybe support for non-Python plugins, maybe improve some defaults. There are many things that could be done. Yeah, that's basically it. If you have any questions, please ask them now or talk to me after the session. Thanks for listening.
The change detection, are you just delegating that to Ansible test, or do you have some sauce over the top?
Actually, for Ansible test, I mean, if I run Ansible test, I'm just delegating it to Ansible test. I mean, for an Ansible test, basically it assumes that the branches are called the same as an Ansible core. So it passes the right name for the main branch. For the other tests, it's basically my own code handling this. It's similar to, I mean, especially for Python, it's also analyzing the import structure to figure out like which code files should also be checked if something is modified. For some other tests, it's doing like a quick check. For example, the documentation test will not run if no file has been modified, which is actually checked by the documentation check, and things like that. But for some of the tests, it just runs them every time because it doesn't really know or can't really decide which parts might be affected. Like for there's one, you can, for example, like build the collection and feed it into Galaxy Importer. And I mean, that one should basically probably always run anyway. Because, yeah. Any more questions? Otherwise, thanks a lot and see you around later.